The wind howled through the frozen wilderness, carrying with it the bitter sting of ice and snow. Luke pulled his jacket tighter, his breath escaping in thick, visible clouds as he trudged through knee-high drifts. The old cabin lay just ahead, nestled between the jagged rocks and skeletal trees, a lone sanctuary in an unforgiving world. He had been living in solitude for years, preferring the silence of the wild over the noise of civilization. People were complicated. Out here, survival was simple. Keep warm, find food, stay alive. But tonight, something felt different. A shape in the snow caught his eye. At first, he thought it was just another pile of ice, one of the many formations sculpted by the relentless storm. But as he stepped closer, he saw movement, weak, barely there. A woman. No, not a woman. Luke froze. Even in the dim, bluish light of the storm, he could see she wasn't human. Her skin was a deep shade of sapphire, glowing faintly against the snow. Her hair, long and silver, spilled across her shoulders, tangled with frost. And her eyes, huge, luminous, and filled with something desperate, locked onto his. She tried to speak, her lips trembling, but no sound came out. She was shivering violently. The thin, tattered material wrapped around her did nothing against the cold. Luke didn't think. Instinct took over. He dropped to his knees beside her, shaking off his coat. He wrapped it around her frail form, his rough hands brushing against skin that was almost too cold to be real. "Can you move?" he asked, his voice firm but not unkind. She blinked, as if struggling to understand his words. Then, with effort, she nodded, just once. Luke didn't waste time. He lifted her easily, cradling her against his chest. She was impossibly light, as if her bones were hollow. As he carried her through the snow, he could feel the faintest rise and fall of her breath, but it was weak. Too weak. By the time he reached the cabin, his arms were numb, but he didn't stop. He kicked the door open, stepping into the blessed warmth of the fire he had left burning. The flames flickered, casting golden light over the wooden walls, the worn furniture, and now, the alien woman trembling in his arms. He set her down near the fire, pulling the coat tighter around her. Her fingers twitched. Then, slowly, she reached out toward the heat. Luke watched as her skin seemed to absorb the warmth, the faint glow of her body growing brighter. Her breathing steadied, but she was still shaking. She turned to him, those impossibly large eyes locking onto his once more. "I need more," she whispered, her voice like a breeze in the dead of night. Luke frowned. "More heat? The fire's right there." She shook her head, closing her eyes for a moment as if searching for the right words. "Not fire. You." A strange chill ran down Luke's spine, not from fear, but something else, something deeper. Before he could speak, she reached out, her fingers brushing against his wrist. A shock of warmth shot through him, not painful, but intense. Like his body heat was being pulled, drawn into her. He inhaled sharply. "What are you?" he murmured. She opened her eyes again, and for the first time, he saw something in them beyond desperation. Loneliness. "Kyra," she said softly. "I am Kyra, and I am alone." Luke exhaled slowly. He didn't know what the hell was happening, but one thing was certain. This woman, this alien, had stumbled into his world for a reason, and something told him life would never be the same again. Luke stared at her, the firelight casting shadows across her face. Kyra. The name felt strange on his tongue, but it suited her, otherworldly and delicate. He had so many questions, but she looked too weak to answer them now. Survival first, answers later. He grabbed the thickest blanket he had, draping it over her shoulders. Her fingers twitched, gripping the fabric, but she was still shaking. Her eyes flickered shut for a moment, then opened again, unfocused. "You're freezing," Luke muttered. She nodded slightly. "My kind. We don't do well in the cold." Luke crouched beside her, watching as she inched closer to the fire. Her glow had dimmed again. He had seen plenty of strange things in his life, but this was something else entirely. She suddenly shuddered violently, a sharp gasp escaping her lips. Without thinking, he reached out, steadying her shoulders. Her skin was still ice-cold beneath the blanket, and now up close, he could see faint, intricate patterns along her arms, almost like veins but glowing faintly beneath her skin. She was barely holding on. Luke exhaled, hesitating for only a second before pulling her toward him. She stiffened at first, then melted against his warmth, her body relaxing slightly as her breathing steadied. It was strange. He could actually feel her drawing heat from him, like she was absorbing it directly from his skin. She let out a small sigh, barely audible. Better. His grip tightened slightly around her. You're not from around here, he said dryly. A soft, breathless laugh escaped her lips, but there was no humor in it.
No.
He waited, but she didn't say more. He could feel the exhaustion in her body, the way her muscles trembled from the effort of simply staying conscious. Whatever she had been through before he found her, it had drained her to the brink. Sleep, he murmured. We'll talk when you're stronger. Kyra didn't answer, but she didn't resist when he carefully eased her against the blankets near the fire. Within moments, her breathing evened out, her glow dim but steady. Luke sat back, running a hand through his hair. He had spent years avoiding people, choosing solitude over the mess of human connection. And yet, here he was, sitting beside an alien woman who had somehow crash-landed into his life, fragile and freezing in the middle of the wilderness. And despite every instinct telling him to stay detached, to keep his world simple, he knew he couldn't turn away from this. She needed him, and that terrified him more than anything. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the world outside coated in a heavy layer of snow. Luke stirred at the sound of shifting blankets, opening his eyes to find Kyra sitting up, watching him. Her color had returned, the soft blue glow of her skin stronger than before. Her silver hair cascaded over her shoulders, and for the first time, she looked less like a ghost and more like something real, something alive. She didn't speak at first. Neither did he. Then, finally, she broke the silence. You helped me. Luke exhaled, leaning against the wall. Yeah. Seemed like the right thing to do. She studied him, tilting her head slightly. Why? He frowned. Because you would have died. Kyra considered that, as if the concept of being saved was unfamiliar. My people wouldn't have done the same, she admitted quietly. Luke narrowed his eyes. Your people? Where exactly are you from? Kyra hesitated, her fingers brushing absently over the fabric of the blanket. Far from here, she said finally. A place you wouldn't know. He folded his arms. Try me. She met his gaze then, something guarded in her expression. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Luke let out a slow breath. Kyra, I found you half frozen in the middle of nowhere, glowing like a damn firefly. I think we're way past the point of me not believing things. Her lips parted slightly, as if she hadn't expected that answer. Then, finally, she looked away, her voice quiet. I was exiled. That word sat heavy between them. Luke's jaw tightened. Exiled from where? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached out, her fingers grazing his wrist again, and in that moment, something passed between them. An image, a flash of memory that wasn't his own. A city, vast and shimmering, towers of silver and glass stretching into the sky. Creatures like her, moving with effortless grace, their glowing skin illuminating the streets. And above it all, a presence, watching, judging, a force that ruled with cold, unwavering control. Then, just as quickly as it came, the vision was gone. Luke jerked back, breath unsteady. What the hell was that? Kyra's expression was unreadable.
A glimpse.
His mind reeled, trying to process what he had just seen. They cast you out? She nodded, something haunted in her eyes. I broke their laws. And now, they hunt me. Luke's stomach twisted. Hunt you? Kyra's gaze flickered to the window, her shoulders tense. The Silent Legion. They don't let outcasts live. The words sent a chill through him, colder than the winter outside. Luke had no idea what he had just gotten himself into. But one thing was clear. Kyra wasn't just any lost traveler. And if what she said was true, then she wasn't just running from her past. She was running for her life. Luke's fingers twitched toward the rifle leaning against the wall. He had no idea what kind of threat the Silent Legion posed, but something in Kyra's eyes told him they weren't just some distant problem. They were coming. His gut told him to demand answers, to push her for every detail. But the way she held herself, tense, wary, exhausted beyond belief, he knew she wasn't ready for an interrogation. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. How long do we have? Kyra glanced at him, startled. What? Before they find you, he clarified. She hesitated, glancing at the window again. I don't know, she admitted. Days, maybe less. It depends on how much energy I have left to hide. That wasn't the answer he wanted. Luke stood, crossing the small room to check the window. Outside, the world was nothing but white, snow-covered trees stretching for miles. No signs of movement, no shadows lurking in the storm's wake. But that didn't mean they weren't coming. You've been running for a while, he said. Kyra nodded slowly. Since the moment they sent me away. Luke turned back to her. And why'd they do that? Her jaw tensed. He almost thought she wouldn't answer, but after a long silence, she exhaled. Because I wanted something they wouldn't allow. Luke frowned. What was it? Kyra looked at him then, something unreadable in her expression. Freedom. That one word sat between them, heavy with meaning. Luke had never been a man who trusted easily. He had his reasons for living alone, for avoiding the world beyond these woods. But Kyra, she had that same look in her eyes. The look of someone who had been caged for too long. She didn't need to explain further. He understood. Luke let out a breath. All right. Kyra blinked at him. All right. He shrugged. You need a place to lay low. Looks like you found one. Her gaze searched his face, as if trying to understand why he wasn't pushing her away. I don't want to put you in danger, she said quietly. Luke huffed a dry laugh. Too late for that, don't you think? Something flickered in her expression, something like gratitude mixed with unease. She lowered her head slightly. I won't stay long. Luke watched her for a moment, then shook his head. Let's focus on keeping you alive first. We'll figure out the rest later. She studied him for a long time, then finally, she nodded. For now, that was enough. The days that followed were quiet, but not peaceful. Kyra recovered quickly, though she still needed warmth, real warmth. Luke had lost count of how many times she had pressed a hand to his wrist, her touch stealing heat from his body like a lifeline. It should have felt strange, unnatural, but somehow it didn't. He found himself getting used to her presence. The way she moved through the cabin with quiet curiosity, how she studied every little thing like it was alien to her, how she listened to him with an intensity that made it seem like she was memorizing every word. She wasn't just surviving. She was learning. And so was he. She told him more about her people, piece by piece, about the towering cities that glowed with light, the strict laws that governed every aspect of life, the way emotions were considered weaknesses. Luke couldn't imagine a place like that. He didn't want to. What about you? Kyra asked one evening as they sat near the fire. Why do you live out here alone? Luke poked at the fire absently. Guess I got tired of people. She tilted her head, waiting for more. He sighed. Used to be a soldier. Did things I'm not proud of. Figured I'd be better off out here, where I don't have to answer to anyone. Kyra was quiet for a long time. Then, softly, she said, You still saved me. Luke met her gaze, something tightening in his chest. Yeah, he muttered. Guess I did. Neither of them spoke after that. But something had shifted. It happened on the fourth night. Luke had stepped outside to check the perimeter, rifle slung over his shoulder, breath curling in the frozen air. The woods were still, the snow undisturbed, but something in his gut screamed that something was wrong. Then, he saw it. A single, black shard embedded in the snow. It pulsed faintly, like a dying ember. Luke knelt, brushing the frost away. The moment his fingers touched it, a shock ran up his arm. Cold, sharp, unnatural. His pulse pounded. Kyra. He bolted back toward the cabin, heart hammering. She was already standing when he burst through the door, eyes wide, body tense. They're here, she whispered. Luke tossed the shard onto the table. What the hell is this? Her face paled. A beacon. His blood ran cold. How fast? Kyra swallowed. If they've activated it, they'll be here before sunrise. Luke gritted his teeth. He wasn't stupid. If these Silent Legion bastards were anything like Kyra described, fighting them head-on wasn't an option. But running? Not a chance in hell. He turned to her. You ready to fight for your freedom? She stared at him for a long moment. Then, a slow, fierce determination settled over her features.
Yes.
Luke nodded, gripping his rifle tighter. Then let's give them a damn war. The fire crackled behind them as silence fell between them, thick with unspoken understanding. Kyra's fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket, her glowing veins pulsing faintly beneath her skin. She was afraid. He could see it in the way she stood, her shoulders drawn tight, her breaths shallow. But beneath that fear, there was something else. Resolve. Luke had seen that look before. In soldiers who had been backed into a corner with no way out. In men who had nothing left to lose. He exhaled slowly. Tell me everything you know about them.
Now.
Kyra hesitated for only a moment before nodding. The Silent Legion aren't just soldiers. They're enforcers. Hunters. When someone is exiled, they make sure that person never finds a way back. And if they locate me, she trailed off, but the implication was clear. Luke frowned. How many are we talking about? They usually send 3, she said, voice low. 1 to track, 1 to secure, 1 to execute. Luke's stomach twisted, but he forced himself to stay focused. And they're not human. Kyra shook her head. They're like me, but stronger. They don't need rest, and they won't stop until I'm gone. Luke ran a hand over his face. Perfect. 3 highly trained alien assassins hunting down one woman in the middle of nowhere. And now, by extension, they were hunting him too. His pulse steadied. It wouldn't be the first time he'd fought against impossible odds. He moved toward the small wooden chest in the corner, flipping it open. Inside, a worn combat knife, extra rounds for his rifle, and an old revolver gleamed under the dim light. Not much, but better than nothing. He tossed the revolver onto the table in front of her. You know how to use one of these? Kyra glanced at it, then back at him, something almost amused in her expression. I don't need weapons. Luke raised an eyebrow. You sure about that? She held up a hand, palm facing him. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the veins beneath her skin flared bright, and a wave of heat pulsed outward. Not fire, not exactly, something else. A force that made the air shimmer around her fingertips. Luke stepped back, impressed despite himself. That would have been useful to know sooner. Kyra gave him a small, almost teasing look. You never asked. Luke smirked despite himself. All right, Firefly. Let's hope you can handle yourself when the real fight starts. Kyra's expression darkened. I can. Outside, the wind howled. But Luke could hear something else now. A faint hum, just beneath the surface of the world. It wasn't the storm. It was something coming, and it was getting closer. The first sign of them came just before dawn. Luke barely had time to react before a sharp, unnatural vibration tore through the air, making his teeth ache. He gritted his teeth, pressing his back against the cabin wall as he peered outside. 3 figures stood in the distance, just beyond the tree line. They were tall, their bodies draped in dark, shimmering armor that seemed to shift with the wind. Their skin, the same luminescent blue as Kyra's, pulsed faintly beneath their plating. And their eyes, cold, expressionless, locked onto the cabin like predators stalking prey. Luke exhaled through his nose. 3 of them, just like you said. Kyra was rigid beside him, her hands clenched into fists. We have to move. Luke didn't argue. They had spent the night prepping, packing supplies, mapping out an escape route through the trees. Staying in the cabin wasn't an option, not against enemies who clearly had the upper hand. But as they slipped toward the back door, a deep, resonating voice echoed through the trees. Kyra Vela. She stopped cold. Luke turned, rifle raised. The one in the center had stepped forward. Their voice was distorted, but unmistakably female. You have evaded capture long enough, the figure continued. You know why we are here. Kyra swallowed. I won't go back. The soldier tilted their head slightly. You misunderstand. There is no back for you. Luke's grip on the rifle tightened. That was all he needed to hear. Move, he whispered, grabbing Kyra's wrist. She hesitated for only a second before nodding. Then, the air exploded. A shockwave tore through the cabin, splintering the walls as Luke and Kyra dove out the back, rolling into the snow. Luke coughed, ears ringing, but forced himself to his feet. He could see them now, moving toward the wreckage, methodical, relentless. Kyra turned to him, eyes burning. Go. Luke shook his head. Not without you. Another blast shattered the ground where they had stood moments before. Kyra clenched her fists. I can hold them off. Luke stared at her. She meant it, but something deep inside him refused to leave her behind. Not a chance, he growled. Kyra hesitated, something flashing in her expression. Shock, maybe even something close to warmth. Then, the nearest soldier lunged. Luke didn't think. He raised the rifle and fired. The bullet struck center mass, but instead of falling, the soldier barely flinched. Their armor rippled like liquid metal, absorbing the impact. Damn it, Luke muttered. The soldier raised their arm, and the air around them crackled. Luke barely had time to react before Kyra moved, stepping in front of him. She threw out her hands, and a blinding wave of heat pulsed outward. The soldiers staggered, their armor flickering, destabilized for just a moment. It was all the opening Luke needed. He charged forward, slamming the butt of his rifle into the soldier's head. They reeled, and for the first time, Luke saw a crack in their perfect, inhuman composure. Kyra grabbed his arm. We can't win this fight. Not here. Luke clenched his jaw but nodded. They turned and ran, snow crunching beneath their feet as they sprinted toward the trees. Behind them, the silent legion regrouped, their movements eerily synchronized. And as Luke and Kyra disappeared into the dark, frozen wilderness, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. They ran until their lungs burned, until the cold night wrapped around them like a second skin. Snow crunched beneath their boots, but the sounds behind them, those steady, unnatural footsteps, never faded. The silent legion didn't tire, didn't falter. They were hunters, and Kyra was the prey. Luke clenched his jaw. Not if he had anything to say about it. Kyra's grip on his arm tightened as they weaved through the trees, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. We can't outrun them forever. Not planning to, Luke muttered, yanking her behind a thick tree. He pressed his back against the bark, trying to slow his breathing. He wasn't a fool. He knew the odds were against them, but every fight had a weakness. He just needed to find it. Kyra closed her eyes, her glowing veins flickering like dying embers. I can mask my heat signature for a little while, but it won't last. Luke scanned their surroundings. The woods were dense, the uneven terrain littered with boulders and fallen trees. If they could find a way to turn the terrain into an advantage, his gaze flicked upward. A ridge. Steep, jagged, but climbable. He nudged Kyra. Think you can make it up there? She followed his gaze, nodding quickly. I think so. Luke checked behind them. Shadows moved between the trees, silent, methodical. The Legion was closing in. Go, he ordered. Kyra hesitated. What about you? Luke gave her a grim smile. I'll buy you time. Her expression tightened. I'm not leaving you. Not asking you to, he said. Just trust me. For a second, she looked like she might argue. But then, she nodded. Without another word, she turned and started climbing. Luke took a deep breath, steadying himself. Then, he stepped out into the open. The nearest soldier froze, their glowing eyes locking onto him. Luke smirked. Hey there, tin can. The soldier tilted their head slightly. Luke raised his rifle. Come and get me. Then, he ran. The trees blurred past him as he barreled forward, heart pounding. The silent legion moved fast, faster than humanly possible, but that was exactly what he was counting on. He reached the base of the ridge just as Kyra disappeared over the top. Perfect. Then, he spun on his heel and fired. The bullet struck the ground near the lead soldier's feet, sending up a spray of snow. It wasn't meant to kill, It was meant to provoke. And it worked. The soldier lunged. Luke waited until the last second before diving to the side, rolling through the snow as the soldier's momentum carried them forward. The alien slammed into a half-buried log, stumbling. Luke didn't hesitate. He swung his rifle like a club, smashing it against the soldier's exposed head. Their armor flickered again, but this time, they went down hard. One down, two more to go. Luke turned to run, but before he could take a step, a searing force slammed into his chest. He flew backward, hitting the ground with a grunt. Pain exploded through his ribs, but he forced himself up, gasping. One of the remaining soldiers loomed over him, their hands still raised from the attack. Luke gritted his teeth. Okay, that one hurt. The soldier raised their arm again. Then, the air around them erupted in heat. Kyra. She dropped from the ridge like a falling star, her hands glowing with raw energy. A pulse of golden light shot from her palms, slamming into the soldier's chest. For the first time, the Silent Legion screamed. Their body convulsed, armor cracking as Kyra's energy surged through them. The moment they staggered back, Luke was on his feet, driving his knife into the gap between their plates. The soldiers shuddered. Then, they collapsed. Luke exhaled sharply. You really do know how to make an entrance. Kyra barely spared him a glance, her eyes locked on the last remaining soldier. The final member of the Legion didn't move. Instead, they simply stared. Then, in a voice colder than the wind, they said, You have changed, Kyra. Kyra's breath hitched. Luke frowned, looking between them. Friend of yours? Kyra didn't answer immediately. But then, in a barely audible whisper, she said, He was my brother. Luke stiffened. Was? The soldier's expression remained unreadable. You are no longer one of us. Kyra's hands clenched into fists. Because I wanted more than a life of obedience? Silence. Then, her brother took a step forward. Luke raised his rifle instinctively, but Kyra stopped him with a hand on his arm. I'll handle this, she murmured. Luke hesitated, then slowly lowered the gun. Kyra took a deep breath, stepping toward the last soldier. You don't have to do this. Her brother didn't move. Yes, I do. Kyra's eyes burned. Then I'm sorry. The world exploded in light. Heat radiated outward as Kyra unleashed every ounce of power she had left. The snow melted beneath her feet, steam rising in thick waves. Her brother staggered, his armor flickering, cracking, but he didn't fall. Instead, he reached out, through the flames, through the energy, gripping Kyra's wrist. Luke tensed. Then, to his shock, the soldier slowly stepped back. The fire dimmed, the air cooled, and Kyra's brother, his face unreadable, simply said, Run. Kyra's breath caught. What? His gaze softened, just for a second. Run. Before I change my mind. Kyra looked like she wanted to argue, but Luke grabbed her hand. We're leaving. She looked at him, then back at her brother. Finally, she nodded. Without another word, they turned and ran. The Silent Legion did not follow. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of the forest, where the trees gave way to open land and endless stars. Luke bent over, hands on his knees, panting. That was insane. Kyra was silent. Luke looked over at her. She was staring back toward the woods, her expression unreadable. You okay? He asked. She exhaled slowly. I don't know. Luke was quiet for a moment. Then, he gently took her hand. You're free now, he said. That's what matters. Kyra looked at him, her glowing eyes searching his face. Then, she nodded. Together, under the vast, endless sky, they walked forward, toward whatever came next. And for the first time, Kyra wasn't running alone.